Do y'all have any questions that you want us to address before we have the first presentation? Any questions that anyone has?
Dr. Todd.
Yes.
I have a question. I was looking at the weekly schedule,
Yes.
and between weeks 8 and 9, when it talks about finalize the OMA, it also has a SIP. What is that?
Okay, which one are you talking about?
It's on our weekly summer schedule.
Okay, let me look at that a little bit later. Let me write that note and to check. Which week was it?
It's in between weeks 8 and 9.
Okay.
It's the week we don't have a Zoom session.
Okay. You all don't have to do the SIP or the SIP.
Okay.
That probably is held over from one of the 603s that are add-ons. But
Gotcha.
all you all have to worry about is the OMA. But I'll double check on that. There were a few things that either I didn't catch or Dr. Lamb didn't catch. It was we were trying to copy things from one place to another. But I will check that. And I will look and see which one you all do in 604, and we'll probably introduce that task to you for some of you to get started on between the summer session and the fall session. Okay?
Okay.
So
Thank you.
I will double check that. I wrote myself a note.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? All right. Brittany asked if their group could go first because she has to leave early. Does anyone have any objections to that? All right, Brittany, your group can go ahead and do your presentation.
All right, so we had for our case study 2, we had the Leandro case, and I'm just gonna introduce the case real quick. There was parents from 5 school districts in North Carolina in the year 1994. They filed a lawsuit that were saying that schools were unequally funded and children had unequal opportunity compared to other schools in the state. The judge in that case ruled that each child had the right to basic sound education, which that looks and sounds like sufficient ability to read, write, and speak English, a basic understanding of geography, history, as well as economic and political systems, and lastly, a sufficient academic and vocational ability either to attend college or to attend the field of work.
The next part is what amendment did it go against? And those 5 counties filed a lawsuit in 97 against the North Carolina Public Schools, and the plaintiffs argued that despite the higher than average tax rates that schools in the counties ended up with, the higher than average tax rates, the schools in these counties ended up with a lower than average tax revenue. Researching this case a little bit, there's little side notes down at the bottom. You think about like this, each student in the state of North Carolina is allotted about $2,000, not quite that, but almost. And if you have a school with 500 students or more, you're going to get around $1 million or more towards your school for each one of those students, or for the total number of students that you have. And I apply this because my school kind of goes along with one of these 5 schools, or my county does. And if I think about that, almost $2,000 to the number of students in my school, we would be well below that $1 million mark. So not a whole lot of money to go towards each, towards the kids. So the plaintiff's argument was that the quality of child's education ought to not be dependent on the community the child is from and the wealth of their family. The cost of properly educating a disadvantaged child is high, and the state had done nothing to equalize the schools. The proposed solution made by the plaintiffs was a higher funding level that would remain stable for the lower wealth counties. A number of urban schools were allowed to intervene in the Leandro lawsuit. They raised a second and important issue. They claimed that they were burdened with large numbers of heavy concentrations of disadvantaged students that cost more to properly educate. And so their argument was that the state constitution of North Carolina requires that the state provide the school with adequate materials to properly educate the disadvantaged students, poor special education students, and limited English proficient students.
All right, I had the ruling and the lasting impact, and Caleb kind of touched on the ruling already, but it was a unanimous ruling that school districts or counties don't have any constitutional right with the equal funding, but that students do have the constitutional right to an opportunity to receive a sound basic education. And so once they put that last part about an opportunity to receive a sound basic education, what you started seeing is that school districts started giving more equal funding. And you're going to see Title I schools getting more funding to go toward educational needs so that their students are receiving a sound basic education. So as a result, one of the lasting impacts is you start seeing special programs in schools pop up or begin so that students receive that. You've got a pre-K program, summer lunches. We in Gaston County have a Dream Academy that a lot of our low-income kids attend during the summer, and it provides lunch for them. Other activities like Girls on the Run, et cetera, started occurring as well as a result of this court case.
And so schools today, in recent years, North Carolina public schools have experienced reductions in education funding, which in turn have triggered cuts in the essential resources needing, including teachers and the support staff, the programs, especially in schools serving those high concentration areas with low income students and students at risk of academic failure. So progress in expanding access to high quality preschool has also stalled. So for nearly a decade, the constitutional violations have continued without effective remedy. So therefore, they put together specific measures to ensure all North Carolina school children are constitutional right to an adequate education, hold the promise and chronic resources to allow the severe underfunding of the state's public schools. Judge Lee, I saw where someone spoke about him a year ago, established a clear process with firm deadlines for developing a concrete remedial plan for state action to guarantee that all schools have adequate resources to provide all children, no matter what their circumstances, the opportunity for a sound basic education as guaranteed by the North Carolina Constitution. So schools today should have a focus and work plan to examine teaching, administration, and provision of resources necessary to support effective instruction. Many of us have touched on a lot of these things and other tasks throughout this entire program. So those items are teachers focusing on attracting and preparing them, developing and supporting teachers, retaining teachers and extending their reach to influence more students, principals focusing on best practices for effective leadership, particularly those practices used in schools to bring students living in poverty, and then having those adequate resources, reviewing and analyzing the current finance system to assess its adequacy and equity, convening focus groups, drawn from education and other state leaders to understand needs, interests, and options for improving the finance system. And so all this will develop a plan to address those resources adequately with the requirements needed. And that's what we have. Does anybody have any questions?
All right. One of the things that once we hear everybody's, I want us to go back and talk about this a little bit. To start with, Judge Manning was the judge that stayed with this particular case. And when he first started, he would bring out several things at a time. And then he would study it for another length of time. The state board had to address whatever questions he had, then or the state superintendent, and then they would go back to court and provide those answers, and then he would have more questions and they'd go back to court. But it was a very lengthy process, and if you stop and think about when it started and where we are today, we still don't have it totally resolved. So, you know, I'm sure that all of the people who brought the lawsuit, they've already graduated, and hopefully they're being quite successful. But the state has done several things to try to help with getting an equal, sound basic education, not equal, but sound basic education throughout the state. I think that's probably where you saw some of the curriculum come in, where they have the state curriculum. They want everybody teaching regardless of what part of the state they're living in. And then more recently, you've got the assessments that are trying to make sure that all the students have a common knowledge regardless of where they are. All right, does your group have anything else they wish to add?
I think we're good.
All right.
Good.
Okay. All right, if you want to quit sharing, then I don't care which other group goes. Does group 1 want to go next?
Yeah, we can go ahead and do that.
Okay.
All right. Okay, is that showing up on your end?
Yes, it is on mine.
Okay. All right, so we also had the Leandro versus State case study, and kind of throughout, we just tied it in with the actual case study article that was posted there in Blackboard. But background of the case and ruling, in 1994, as already stated, there was a lawsuit filed against the state of North Carolina by the parents of students in low-income rural counties, including the Leandro family. The plaintiffs argued that because their tax revenue was lower than the average counties in the state of North Carolina, that they could not provide an equal education for their children. So within these counties, they couldn't attract the best teachers because teacher pay was much lower, and the school obviously didn't have enough money for educational supplies and other materials that were needed to provide that education. Then the court ruled that neither school districts or counties have a constitutional right to equal funding, but the schools must provide all students with an opportunity to receive a sound and basic education. So they had certain fundamental things they had to provide to them. The Leandro case was used as a precedent in discipline cases for students who are suspended must have their Leandro right to an alternative education. Just some important notes from the actual case study, and then we tied that in with the Leandro case. The superintendent is enforcing a spending account that is connected to low-income students in the school so that these students get the resources they need. Depending on the enrollment numbers is how much money the district will allocate to schools that are in need. And then, of course, at first there was student-based budgeting system that went into staffing ratios, but this did not help the district with the student needs and the school's diverse needs. So it wasn't actually helping those students who had certain needs related to their education. And then there will be a dollar amount set to each student depending on their need and the school they were located at. Again, tying both together, within the actual case study, money originally was being allocated to individual schools based on the number of students and staff at that school. However, within the case study, the superintendent of that district would be allocating money through student-based budgeting, and that's where the money would follow particular students, hoping to aim towards their academic progress and success and meet their individual needs. And then through the Leandro case, it aimed to ensure that all students' educational needs were met and that all students had equal access to a proper education, as did the superintendent in the case study.
Okay, then we deemed some things that were not appropriate, how we felt, like within the Leandro case, it was not appropriate for the schools of economically disadvantaged students to not receive the best education and an equal education that students of wealthier communities were receiving. So in these particular school districts, the students were not equipped with the educational materials or services needed to make them successful. Also, that money should be allocated and divided as evenly as possible to each school based on the academic needs of the students. The superintendent in case study 2 also made sure to inform the community of his decision to make sure that students were receiving an equal education based on student academics needs. And we had some legal and ethical concerns that we thought. We wanted to make certain that equity and fairness were shown to promote social justice and ensure that individual student needs inform all aspects of schooling, the best interests of students, their rights, responsibility, respect are the keys in making the decisions that are in the student's best interests. All children residing in North Carolina have a fundamental state constitutional right to, hold on, I can't really see that piece. Okay, to the opportunity to receive a sound basic education, provides children and youth with all the opportunities necessary to become an adult, possessing that opportunity to receive a sound basic education. It was meant that to make sure that they have a sufficient ability to read, write, and speak the English language, and a sufficient knowledge of fundamental mathematics and physical science to enable the student to function in a complex and rapidly changing society, sufficient fundamental knowledge of geography, history, and basic economic and political systems to enable the student to make informed choices with regard to issues that affect the student personally or affect the student's community, state, and nation. Also, sufficient academic and vocational skills to enable the student to successfully engage in post-secondary education or vocational training, and sufficient academic and vocational skills to enable the student to compete on an equal basis with others in further formal education or gainful employment in contemporary society. So those were our thoughts concerning that case. Any questions?
All right, as you studied, as the two groups studied the Leandro case, can you think back and figure out how that case has affected what you're doing today and what's happening in the state of North Carolina? Let me rephrase the question. Do you know how funding comes to your schools today?
I know some of it comes through the county, the state, and the federal government.
That is right. Funding comes from the county, the state, and the federal government. The county, their basic role is to look and take care of your facilities. It is normally considered, and county commissioners at their county commissioner meetings, they are told your job is to take care of the facilities in the school system. Now, because of big cities that have some high poverty groups, they started providing supplements so they could get teachers. And so that also meant that rural counties such as Yadkin and Stokes and Wilkes were having trouble getting teachers because they could go to Forsyth or Guilford and they could make more money. And yes, there were different issues that they faced there, but a lot of people coming out of college needed the money. And so they then reluctantly, county commissioners in more rural areas, and let me emphasize reluctantly, agreed to let some of their local money go to pay for supplements. But in the more rural areas, they said the max it will be is this, a certain percentage. They did not want it going any higher. I know in Yadkin when I was working, they didn't want it over 5% because they said, you know, we don't have that large of a tax base, and so we just can't afford it. In addition to the supplement and the facilities, you know, they have to keep the roofs fixed. They have to keep the floors fixed. They have to do the paving around your schools. That's all county. In addition to that, most of the counties pay for clerical, and they also may pay for maintenance and transportation. Not all of transportation, but some of it. So, but their maintenance is one group that they'll pay for, and clerical. So that usually comes from the county. Your school board is the group that has to come up with a budget that they submit to the county requesting funds. And different groups and different county county managers do it a little bit differently. Some of them want to know everything that every dollar is going to be spent on. So you have to have projections as early as April as to what things are going to cost when you're going to be doing them the next year. So it gets to be a very complicated process. Now the state, the way the constitutions were set up, The state was given the authority for public education, for educating the people who lived in their state. So that is why most of the funding for schools, for public schools, comes from the state. That's where the largest majority of the teaching positions come from. And in most situations, it is a teaching position that comes. It's a state teaching position. And that will come to your central office, and then they will designate which school the position goes to based on the number of students in the school. Whenever a school system loses students, which many of the rural areas, from what I understand, are losing students, and they're showing up in the larger city areas. So that causes the rurals to lose funding, and then the city systems will gain some funding because that's where the children are going. Now, they also will give a little bit for materials and supplies, but that's been being cut the last few years to where most schools are having to send things out through their PTA and request funding from whatever business lives in their particular school district, or whatever group of parents they can get to pay and to help with materials and supplies. So it has become where the schools are really having to search for the money for the supplies and materials. Textbooks, technology, that used to be the responsibility of the state. The state gives very little for technology unless it is improved in the last few years. So the counties and the school systems have had to come up with PTA plans and all of that to get more and more of the technology. There is still some money that comes through the state. The federal comes in with special area that they have money for. And you mentioned some of them in your Leandro case. And I'm going to try to watch the time to keep from running out of time with the other group that still got to present. Most of the time, the federal money comes in for exceptional children. It comes in for school free and reduced lunch. It comes in for career and technical education, and it comes in for Title I. Those are your main programs that have money that comes to your school. Now, if you think about the Title I and the EC, those are designated populations. And so the schools that have more of those students would get more of the funding for that, because it would go to those schools. But whoever's at your central office has to decide where those children are. And in some situations, if you're in a rural school system, you may have a class for autistic children, younger and older autistic children, at more of a central location where a lot of kids are bussed in. You may have a class for behavioral, severe behavioral in another school not too far from the center of things, or you may have one in two different ends. But they are centralized so the students can be bused there, because you can't afford most of the time to offer all of those services in all of the counties. I mean, in all of the schools in the county. So you're right in that the money comes from state, local, and federal. Each one has a specific area that they're usually looked at for being responsible for. Now, the important thing to remember, funding and not doing what you're supposed to do with the money that comes to you is one of the quickest ways you can get fired. Because they'll look at it as misappropriation, they'll look at it as misuse of funds. The funds that come to your county are usually designated. And you can't, like this superintendent, he was looking at doing something that seemed to be a novel idea and a good idea. But at the same time, he wasn't taking into account where the money came from and what the money was supposed to be being used for. So unless somebody was really careful that was looking after that, he could have got in a world of hurt and be in a lot of trouble with either the feds or the state or even the locals. So whenever that money comes to the school system, that's why the finance officer sometimes can be difficult to get along with, but that's his or her job. They have got to protect the school system and make sure that every dollar is used the way it's sent to your school system. Now, a lot of times the reason the state doesn't send money for teaching positions is because it's cheaper for them to keep the money and draw the interest on it than send it to your school system. And then they send the money at the exact time that that the county needs to pay them for that particular teacher. Now, there are pots of money with certain teachers that are paid out of it, of that particular pot of money. And that would be the EC teachers. They're usually paid out of the allotment that comes as a big block grant. The Title I teachers are usually paid out of an allotment that comes as a big block grant. Now, their pay is usually based on the same salary schedule that everybody in the state is paid on, but that's where it comes from. So one of the first things that you really need to do once you become a principal or even an assistant principal is get to know your finance person extremely well. Know what, whenever your central office sends you money, they'll send you a sheet of paper that says, you know, materials and supplies, X dollars. It will have technology, X dollars that you can spend. Now, most of the time, the teaching positions won't come to your school because they've been taken care of, and it will be at the central office. They always put the more expensive teachers in the state allotted positions. And that way you don't have to worry so much about what those teachers cost. However, if it is an EC teacher, it has to be paid out of EC money. If it is a Title I teacher, it has to be paid out of Title I money. So one of the best things for you to do, and hopefully that's one of the reasons I've been trying to make sure that you also read some information in the textbook that's about the finance. You all really need to have a good, thorough understanding of how the money comes to your school system and that you have to spend it for the way it's allotted. If you don't, you will get in trouble. I can almost promise you that. If it's a small amount, they won't say anything. If it's just human error and it's a small amount, they'll let you repay it. If it's a big amount, you'll be in a lot of trouble and on the front page of the newspaper, and you don't want that. So one of the most important things for you to do is to get to know your finance person. Make sure that that person knows what they're doing. When you hire a new secretary and put them in charge of your budget, you better know that they're smart enough to figure out what they're doing, and you also better know that they're honest, because people have taken money from schools and they figured out a way to embezzle it. And so you've got to be very, very cautious when you're dealing with money. And if you ever are in a situation you suspect that and you think there should be money there, don't hesitate to call your central office and find out what it was spent for if you don't get all the purchase orders and sign all of them. Most of the time, you will want the purchase orders to come by for you to look at. But when it all comes at one time and it's very fast, you may not pay close attention to what it is. But there's so many little things that deal with money that it's really important that you understand that. Did I help give you an overview of finance that helps you a little bit understand it more so? I don't think it's been this class, but in one of the classes I had, I think it was last semester, a student told me that they did not get any federal or state money, that all of their money came locally. And I thought, okay, they really don't have a clue where the money is coming from and how their whole thing is. Almost the majority of the funding does come from the state. Your locals will have some money, but a lot of that is going to be geared to the facility. And then your special programs that are federally, that the laws are federally related, they will send some money. it is a small amount of federal money that you get, but at the same time, you can't afford not to use that money and have that money because of what is required for you to provide these services for. So any questions about anything that I have said?
Yeah,
Yes,
Dr. Todd, I want to ask you a question. I want to get it clear. So when it comes to the state provides the money and is based on the students, correct?
mm-hmm.
So what I'm beginning to understand more now is that, so when you have a school and a public school and they lose a student to private or charter schools, the money follows the student.
Unfortunately, that is correct, but it's not private schools that it follows. It's charter schools is where it follows. So, for example, if you've got a charter school in your system where some of your students used to come or they live in your school district, your superintendent will get a bill monthly from the charter school for any students who lives in your county that's going to their charter school, and your superintendent then will have to have the finance officer turn around and send a check to that charter school that has never had to beg for a dime. If you cannot tell that that's a sore subject for me, let me tell you it is. But I would get these bills from 2 or 3 charter schools. Now, Yadkin County didn't have that many, but we had them in Surrey, we had them in Iredell, and I think we had one in Wilkes. I know we had 1 or 2 in Surrey and 1 in Iredell that some of our children would go to, and I would get a bill. But I'm the one who had to go and beg from the county, but I still had to send them my state money and my local money. And that just really ticked me off every time we had to write the check. You know, maybe I shouldn't have felt that way, but I did.
Dr. Todd,
let's let David finish. And it'll get you.
Okay, yeah, because now, and so I figured, so when that means that school is actually losing money, correct?
Yes, your school system is losing the money.
The system is losing money. Now, where does the voucher comes into place? Does that is only, and so that's why I said private schools.
All right, the voucher is probably going to be the very same thing, but I'm not that familiar with the voucher because it had not come into play when I was still working, and I think it's something relatively new. And I think the voucher is for the let's see, let me think about, it was getting ready to come in when I retired. Seems like the voucher was for the children that went to schools that were considered non-performing schools, and then they were allowed to choose whatever other school that they chose to go to.
Yes.
If the other school would accept them. Now, is that what you all are understanding?
Yes, that's my understanding of how that it's kind of it's weeded out for certain students and an opportunity for them to go to a school based on the school they're coming from.
I tell you what I will do. I'll do some checking on that, and I'll try to have an answer about the vouchers, because the vouchers are for private schools. The charters just send us a bill.
Gotcha.
They're considered state. So I'll do some checking and I'll get you a clearer answer about that. All right, Tisha, do you have a question?
Well, I have a question. I was going to make a statement regarding the 2 statements with the charter schools. When I was a guidance secretary, we knew that what was going on with the money, because we would have the hardest time getting students released to come back to the public schools, because we knew that that money was tied to them. So we would, have to constantly ask them to release the students, send records. And then as far as the voucher, I know, like, with my nephew, he was going to public school and he's now going to private school because he's high functioning autistic and he's not able to get what he needs in the public school. So we were able to get, I guess, scholarship or voucher or grants for him to now go to a particular school that geared towards students who are autistic or have other disabilities that are high functioning. So it doesn't necessarily have to be anything wrong. I know a coworker has her children go to a private school just because that she thought that was better for them.
Right. And
she get vouchers.
Things like the autistic, that's going to come out of the EC funds. So that's, you know, anything that's considered EC, that's the group that has to pay for it. And if your system doesn't offer the services that the child needs, then they are responsible for finding a program for the child to go to, and then they do have to help pay for it. Okay. All right. Any other questions while we're dealing with this? And I have wrote myself a note to check more on vouchers to make sure I give you correct information on that. Anything else? I just want you to have a good basic understanding of where your money comes from. And you are provided money based on the number of students who come to your school. That's where your basic allotment of money that comes to the school starts. Several years ago, they added a low wealth system, low wealth funding, and a lot of school systems, and it came from this, the Leandro case. A lot of school systems qualified because there are a lot of school systems that don't have a lot of industry that will help bring in money for the county to be able to use for education. So that was an extra allotment that the systems got to go toward funding to get where we were low wealth. You got additional monies that you could use for certain things. And sometimes it might be to reduce class size. Sometimes it might be for, you could spread it across a group, or you could use it for a particular thing. But it was money that came specifically for low wealth. Now, I'm not sure that that still exists, but it got to be where a large portion of the school systems qualified for that. All right, any other questions before we get our group 4 to do their presentation? All right, let's go to group 4.
Let me share my screen. All right, hopefully y'all can see that.
Yes,
Excellent.
it's good.
All right, so for our focus of this presentation, we were ultimately supposed to identify whether we believed the superintendent's plan for the student-based budgeting for the district was appropriate or not. And though we had multiple discussions, both focusing clearly on the legal and ethical side, we kind of came to a unanimous agreement that yes, this is appropriate. However, there are many questions to be addressed, and we're going to get into that right about now. My partner is there with me.
Yeah, we're trying to. Are you trying to give control, or are you just going to keep driving?
I'll keep driving the car.
Okay. So one of the biggest questions come out of this with Leandro was the resource distribution. The goal here was to make sure that all the kids received an equal opportunity for education per the Leandro case. Leandro didn't say they had to equal funding, but they all had to have that same basic chance to get a sound basic education. Their logic behind the ruling was that the local government can supplement schools as they see fit. So there's no legal basis that says, they can't pour more or less money into their local system for what they want it to be used for. This then gives the principal a chance to use the resources as, they feel appropriate, and then they can make that money determination for the specific funding pots that they want to pull out of to cover the needs that they have to, pay for. So this is the support for the student-based budgeting. And then when you look at against it, the 3 key pieces of Leandro were they had to have access to competent, certified, well-trained teachers. We asked the question here was, well, does this penalize high-poverty schools? And we'll address a little bit more with the ethical side of it. Adequate education, subsequent rulings by Judge Manning so far haven't been able to be met, and it's a continuing thing since Judge Lee has taken over after Manning's retirement in 2015. The example there was like the 90% proficiency on EOC, EOGs. The state has consistently failed to meet that since the initial ruling was made. And then finally, we looked at, discrimination of certain subgroups, your high poverty, your high diversity, your areas of high special needs. What are they going to lose when we start to shift this money from one school to another because of our student-based budgeting formulas?
Anthony, could you go back to the slide that said support for? I just wanted to hit just a little bit more detail on the principal being empowered. Principals are leaders of the school, so the support for this is the principal knows what the needs are for the school. So the idea is that they know what the needs, where they need to spend the money. And I believe our school system that I work for does something similar to this. I'm not sure if it's exactly the student-based budgeting concept, but it is something similar, as I was a part of the breakdown process of how funds are used this past school year. And I do believe that it is very effective for the principal to have a lot of decision-making process with how funds are used in their specific buildings. And then if you could go to the next slide, Anthony, on the arguments against it. Just to hit on the discrimination piece, certain schools are located in high poverty areas. So again, we want the argument against it is that the funding would not be equal or not be the same for these high poverty areas with students with these high needs. So we're talking about the high need areas when we're talking about against the student-based budgeting.
And then from the ethical perspective, again, we both have the support and the arguments against. The first and foremost comes from the existence of equity. It doesn't matter where that student is at school, their dollar amount allotted to them is going to be the same no matter what district they may be in, whether that be a high poverty district or a highly affluent area. Additionally, we have that transparency, being that we've got the established amount set per student, so everybody knows, again, going to Wake County to here in Henderson County, that these students, according to this algorithm or this formula, are receiving the exact same financial aid. On the reverse side of that, we get into the arguments, and I'm going to kind of jump around here. But going down here to actually talking about that specific formula, never in the superintendent's memo to parents was that formula addressed, other than the simple statement of your principal will contact you in the future, or you contact your principal for additional information. Because one thing we discussed that we encountered is, how do you differentiate in a dollar amount, for example, an ELL student who is achieving maybe 60% proficiency in the English language in comparison to a student who is brand new to the country and doesn't speak a lick of English. Because being that they're both identified as ELL, they should technically be receiving the same dollar amount. However, clearly their specific needs between those students are very different. So we definitely wanted to know what specifically is the formula, and if it actually really specifies the greater need within ELL, within EC, and all these different subgroups. Additionally, we encountered arguments regarding transient populations, and that one is very personal to me myself, as we are an alternative program, and we do have a very transient population throughout the school year. Though we max out at 200, we might start the year with 150, get a bunch loaded onto us from the base schools through the referral process, raising us up to 190, 200. And then we do frequently have dropouts, early graduates, so on and so forth. So that runs into an issue with the flow of money to and from the school. And finally, one of the last major ethical issues we encountered is that it really does incentivize recruitment, where you're going to have your higher population schools reach out and start picking and choosing what students they want to come and try and get more away from those more rural communities that you were speaking of, Dr. Todd, causing those districts themselves to really lose funding. And when it comes to public education, this should not be about recruiting, because needless to say, every school should have that equal and fair treatment of students based on education.
Stay right there for a second. On the incentivizing recruitment, the system I'm in is currently experiencing a piece of this. There was a history prior to the 80s where it was a city school and then the county schools. And in the mid-80s, they merged into a single system. Well, the city school used to have all the support from the city and the finances, and it was a top 16 in the state school. Once they took it into the county, there was some old rivalries and some politics that's taken place, and they've done a good job of trying to destroy the school. Well, we recently had an article in our paper come out talking about how we needed to merge because we're a failing school. Wasn't factual, did not meet all of the real numbers, but it's this opinion piece that keeps an identity for a building so that they're trying to push an idea, and it keeps our kids from coming to our school. So students that go to us from middle school will leave and go to the charter school, or they have open enrollment, so they'll request to go to the schools that have a better reputation than our school, even if we're a higher rank, so to speak, than that one. And it's led to this ideology that, you know, when you start putting dollar values to students and then you start to destroy the reputation of a building, you're going to create a situation of inequity for that one school. And then when you have a community that buys into it outside of your local city, it really starts to eat away at the resources available to those kids. So having lived through that right now, I really have issues ethically when you start setting up a situation that breeds this kind of competition that's not necessary.
I agree with you. I agree with you. All right. Anything else with your presentation?
That's about it.
All right. You, Brian, you mentioned something that made me think of something that happened to me when I was a superintendent. Nick will be aware of this partially. He's too young to know what we went through to get the middle schools that we currently have. It only took, now realize Yadkin is a rural system, basically. It only took us approximately 10 to 15 years to get the community to buy in that we would be better off to have 2 middle schools rather than every school continue to be K-8s. And at the time, it was true. We needed that because every school was growing. I was there at a time that all the schools were growing. We were gaining roughly, over a 10-year period, we had gained around 100 students a year. Now that's a lot of students for a small rural system. So the information we were giving was very factual, and it was true then. Well, now it would not be true because they've lost almost as many students as we had gained. And I think it hit the time that the economic downturn occurred, and I think that's when it really hit because, you know, Yadkin County doesn't have a lot of jobs available, and that's true of almost all rural counties, and I think that's why they were hit so hard. But we did presentations at every school, every of the K-8 schools, and we would take the facts and we would share the facts, and we would have parents who would stand up and say they had heard this and they knew we were lying. And we're standing there, school board and the superintendent, the principal of the school, and we all know we're giving you facts, you know. But what can you do with that piece, that perception where somebody is so sure you're lying because you work for the school system? But that happened to us, and it's probably one of those things you're going to always have to deal with. People would rather believe a lie that their neighbor tells them than the truth when you got the facts. And I don't know how you get through that. I wish I knew.
It's really interesting in our county. The city, the people in our district love our school. People that went there, like the pride runs through them deep for the traditions of that school. Yeah. It's when you get out to the county that you have that different ideology. And it was bad enough that our principal wrote a letter to the editor to, go against what was put in the paper and say, hey, you missed some key points. So the county perception is what we're fighting. Our local in district, they all know and they all support us. We just have, 3 other high schools that we're trying to compete against. And when people are right there on that border, closer to one, they'll say, well, I want my kid to go there instead because I've heard that.
Well, and I would say almost every system has some of that. Our schools, I actually had a person ask me recently, which elementary school was the better school? And I said, I would not ever hesitate to send my child to any school in Yadkin County, because if the parents do their job, which is to assist and work with a teacher, then any school in this county, those children are going to get a good education. But because of the same things you're talking about, the 2 larger elementary schools, K-6 schools, and I'll explain that in a minute too. The 2 larger schools have a more transient population, and they also have more minorities, and they have more English as second language. And so people get the perception that that school doesn't do a good job with students because their test scores are lower. Well, good gracious, if all of these other schools had to deal with what those 2 schools have to deal with, their scores would be a whole lot lower too. And so I think, you can't just look at the scores and think this is the answer, this is the best school to go to, because it's not true. And what one parent thinks is true is probably not the same for another parent. And I'll give you an example of that. I happened to be, when my children were growing up, I actually worked in Wilkes County when they were young. And so I happened to be at a ball game where one of them was playing t-ball or something. And I overheard this parent talking about what a wonderful teacher this person was, and that if the children got that teacher, they'd just be in so much better shape. Well, I listened to it, and I never, ever requested teachers for my children. They got the luck of the draw just like every other kid's parents got. So anyway, this particular teacher happened to be the one my child got the next year. Well, I didn't find all that expert teaching that they were talking about. As a matter of fact, I thought that was one of the poorest taught years that my child had. But, it's difference in perception, because the people who were talking, I thought they knew what they were talking about. I never, ever said what my thoughts were, and I won't tell anybody what grade that child was in when that happened, so people could go back. But it's a lot of perception. And the thing I was going to make sure that Nick knew about is the reason the school system in Yadkin County has 7th and 8th grade only at this point is that's all the county had the ability to borrow and still start doing their water system. They did not have enough money that they could borrow to actually build the schools big enough for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So that's why you wound up with 7th and 8th grade. That's probably also a good reason that some of the other school systems like Ashe County, they are 7th and 8th grade, but they use their existing facilities and they move kids around to what their facilities would hold. So, you get into all kinds of political situations that you deal with when you're dealing with public education. And you just try to be honest and give the facts and hope that there's enough wise people out there that they'll believe it. But when you go to some of the schools that's supposed to be the better functioning schools with better parents, because supposedly there's more college education there, and they're the ones that calls you a liar because their neighbor told you something different, you get a whole different perspective on the way things are. People would rather believe a lie than the truth. And that has just really bugged me for years. It did the whole time I was the superintendent, and I don't think I really realized how bad it was until I got to the central office. And I started seeing it as an assistant superintendent. But then, you know, when we were trying to do those presentations and go from school to school to make sure everybody had the facts, and we would give the information out long before and have them publicized and everything. And then to have those kinds of things happen, it was just like, okay, just hit me in the face, knock me down. You know, here we are trying to be as honest as we know how, and you just don't want to believe it. And that's the truth. They don't want to believe it. Change is very hard, and they don't want the change. So they'll believe anything their neighbor tells them that seems like a negative rather than to deal with the truth and make the change. One of the things that one of the slides, and I'm looking at our time, we don't have much time left, but one of the things that one of you said in one of your slides was that we had not made the 90% proficient. That is correct. One of the things I think that happens, and I'm sure you all know it at the classroom level, is they continue to change what is proficient level. And it goes up every time they make a revision in the curriculum and buy new textbooks or new technology, whatever. And they usually do those revisions about every 5 years. So, you know, if it were to ever stay the same, it might be that we'd be there. But it continues to change, and it usually goes higher. And it probably did start out way too low to start with. But it does continue to go higher, or at least that was my perception. So it's hard, but there are some schools, and I'm sure somewhere along the line you will run across this if you haven't already. There are some schools that have 90% in poverty, they're 90% proficient, and they're 90% minorities. Those schools do exist. And I encourage any of you that are concerned about the performance of your school to check in and see do some research on those schools and find out what strategies they're using, what they've done to get parent buy-in, and see how they've met that 90% proficient. So, you know, they do exist and they're out there. So it can be done, but it takes everybody, and I do mean everybody, working together to do that. We've talked a little bit about the federal, how do you think the federal legislation, No Child Left Behind, has affected education while we've had the Leandro case going on?
I guess it's kind of handcuffed some situations because of class sizes that we have to have now, and how you use your money and the special programs you want to put in, and the focus on literacy and everything outweighs most of everything else.
And I think you're right. Right now, you have to spend a certain amount of time on literacy, a certain amount of time on math, and sometimes some of the other things that kids really enjoy get neglected. And sometimes some argue that increases those interested in not coming to school because they can't find anything they're good at and they can't find anything they enjoy. I think there has to be a balance in public schools of things that people enjoy, children enjoy, as well as learning how to read and do math and learn how to write. So I think that there's just a lot of things that go into how a school performs. Be thinking about those questions, and we're not going to spend any more time tonight on it, but be thinking about those questions that's on your agenda. And then I just put some reminders about the tort liability, negligence, and all of that for you to look back over. Now, I'm going to see if I can. I don't have much time. I have made changes in the case study directions to tell you for 3 and 4 which ones that you work on. So let me see if it will allow me to get there. Yes, maybe it will. All right. All right, for, I think it's 8. Yes, I put it in here. I did not put it in under case study, but in the week 8, which will actually be next week. You all will talk about it next week, and then you'll present it on the 16th. So groups 3 and 4 will address these 4 questions, and then groups 1 and 2 will deal with the bullying and cyberbullying. So then that's week 8, and then you'll do your presentation on the 16th. And then I went ahead and I did move this case study so that you'd have time to work on it in week 9 and do your presentation. And for this one, groups 1 and 3 will address the first 3 questions, and groups 2 and 4 will address the last 3 questions. So make sure you go to the week, and that way you'll see what it is where I made the changes. And that way you all can do more research on the particular idea that you are looking at, and we'll get more thorough information than every group doing all of the same thing. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Do you have any other questions for me, or does anyone need to talk to me after I end the meeting? Okay. I hope you have a wonderful 4th of July, and I hope you have a very safe 4th of July. So have a great week.
You too.
You too.
Thank you.